So very last, let's go right through it. The very last panel, number 6, with 2 wonderful talks coming up under the title National and Supranational Identities in Arts and Crafts. So we're shifting, again, perspectives. And our first paper would be by Julia Zeklena. She's an art historian, a research fellow at the Art History Department at Masaryk University, and her research focuses on regional, rural aspects of Central European modernism, and is part of the project CRAACE, of course, with a conference entitled "The Female Factor: Representing Austrian Identity at the 1925 Exposition des Arts Industriels et Décoratifs."
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Jana. And thank you, well, Victor and the whole Institute for this really great event. And even though you said that I work on rural modernism, which is true, today I'll be speaking on something different. And I hope interesting nonetheless. Right. So, the opening of the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels in Paris in early May 1925 was an important event for the revival of Austrian arts and crafts after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. Open until November of the same year, the Expo was the first of its kind after the Great War and attracted close to 16 million visitors. This kind of exposure offered a welcome opportunity to emphasize Austria's continued might in the fields of arts and design, but also to show national unity in a country that was politically split between predominantly the Social Democrats and the Christian social right-wing parties. Without Germany's participation, not least, Austria was the only German-speaking country represented, and officials saw it as the first occasion at which the new country could showcase its post-imperial identity as a small and modern state. Indeed, modernity was the keyword for the exhibition overall, with the main goal to present a new modern style based on technological, industrial, and scientific advances. Overall, Austria's presentation was set to emphasize a natural disposition toward craftwork and artisanship, which Austria's Minister of Trade and Commerce, in his opening speech, based on the specific, that's a quote, the specific aptitudes of a people who quite naturally and to a large extent possess artistic talents based on a centuries-old tradition, end of quote. With Vienna's Museum of Art and Industry and the Academy of Applied Arts as its cornerstones, the decorative arts were ascribed, in the words of Foreign Minister Alfred Grünberger, a most effective role in the recovery of our country. In relation to the sense of renewal that showed how Austria had overcome the social and political struggles of the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and its aftermath, architect Franz Quidenus, the president of the Commission, emphasized, "This is why this exhibition is perhaps more important for Austria than for other countries. For us, the decorative and industrial arts are not a matter of taste or a hobbyist's passion. They are already a strong support for our economic existence and a hope for our future." The central institutions to mark this involvement were the Academy of Applied Arts and the Viennese Workshops, or the Wiener Werkstätte Design Company, 2 institutions which had already been fundamental to the renewal of Austrian design at the turn of the century, and after 1918 were seen as the country's best chance of forging a new direction in design in dialogue with international developments. Of the individuals representing these institutions at the Expo, it was predominantly established male architects and designers who received dedicated mention in the contemporary press, as well as in later scholarship. They include first and foremost Josef Hoffmann, the Austrian Pavilion's main architect, as well as a professor of the Academy of Applied Arts and one of the co-founder of the Wiener Werkstätte in 1904. With these positions, Hoffmann held the claim to being the leading figure of Austrian design, who had already designed several other pavilions for the Austrian state since the beginning of the 20th century and would design more during the course of the interwar years. In many ways, therefore, he was and still is seen as the most indispensable person for Austria's international presentation after 1918. For his design of the Paris Pavilion, Hoffmann was assisted by the young architects Oswald Hertel, who we've already heard about today, and Max Fellerer, and designed a low building with horizontally striped reliefs painted in light pink. The architects Oskar Strnad, Josef Frank, and Peter Behrens designed the galleries and organ tower, the large terrace expanding the limited space for the pavilion with a popular Viennese cafe overlooking the Seine, and an expressionist-style glasshouse. The tapestry section was overseen by the artist Albert Paris-Gütersloh, a former member of the artist circus around Gustav Klimt, while a highly popular exhibition on child art was defined by the pedagogical work of Franz Zizek, one of several professors from the Academy of Applied Arts represented at the exhibition. Looking at its long list of representatives, who are usually credited with the Austrian contribution to this expo, and not to forget Friedrich Kiesler's Raumstadt in the stage design section. It was mostly the men who had shaped Viennese art and design at the turn of the 20th century that also took center stage quarter of a century later, even though social and political circumstances had shifted significantly. Yet these changes were crucial to another facet of Austria's presence at the expo, which has received barely any attention in comparison: the female designers who also made significant contributions to the pavilion. Taking this into account, my paper today asks about the female factor in representing Austria at the 1925 Expo, as well as its wider implications in relation to Austrian identity in the interwar period. As a recent exhibition at the Museum of Applied Arts, or the MAC in Vienna, has emphasized, numerous students at the Academy of Applied Arts were women designers, many from elite or bourgeois Jewish backgrounds, who went on to work for the Viennese workshops or founded their own studios. Building on the important contribution of the MAC exhibition and related efforts to raise the visibility of Austria's women artists, my paper suggests that Austria's presentation at the 1925 Expo was to a large extent indebted to contributions by precisely these women. The critical reception of their work reveals the inherent gender bias of Austrian interwar design, which devalued the expressionist forms of its female creators with a rhetoric that instead praised the clarity and utility of functionalism that had found little reception in Vienna overall. I argue that women's contributions to the pavilion specifically, and to Austrian design more broadly, were frequently blamed for the wrongs of Austrian design. Female artists and designers' decisive role in developing new directions in Austrian design after 1918 was thus either reflected in negative terms or not at all. Pairing women's contributions to the pavilion with descriptions of craft work as, and I quote, merely decorative, impractical, and too luxurious, critics of the pavilion, who on account of Austria's dire financial losses from the participation in the expo, were in the majority. And they tied the design failures of the pavilion to women's participation. In the process, debates about Austria's post-imperial identity, as well as new directions in design education, developed a highly charged discourse skewed by dismissive attitudes and vicious attacks by established male cultural figures against the new generation of women artists, thinly veiled as criticism of bad design practice. The artist Julius Klinger renamed the Viennese workshops the Viennese Brutes Crafts, for example, while Adolf Loos, ever critical of the Academy of Applied Arts, famously described its female designers as, and I quote, valuable, material-wasting, dilettante daughters of senior civil servants who regard craft as a way of making pocket change before walking down the aisle. While they represent the most extreme form of criticism against craftswomen, Klinger and Loh's comments exemplify how the profession of the Kunstgewerblerin or craftswoman as a typification of modern femininity gained strong visibility in Viennese culture by the mid-1920s, but mostly with negative connotations. As short-haired, smoking, extravagant women, the Kunstgewerblerin represented a Viennese version of the new woman in books such as Joseph Roth's The Emperor's Tomb, as well as in films like Episode, starring the popular actress Paula Vesely as a young ceramicist and student at the Academy of Applied Arts. As regards the Kunstgewerblerin's professionalism, an intrinsic element of the negative attitudes towards her was the accusation that women approached the profession blue-eyed and in the hope of quick success, seeing it as a fashionable pastime rather than a serious profession. The example of the female contributions of the Austrian pavilion shows quite a different reality, however. Women's craftsmanship was not only undervalued, but also took the brunt of criticism and blame for the wrongs of Austrian crafts overall, even though it was their works in ceramics, textile design, and wall painting, among other things, which forged an updated image of Austrian design alongside their established male peers. Women's involvement in the Paris Expo was intrinsic to the interior design of the pavilion, the Austrian rooms at the Grand Palais, as well as the galleries de l'Esplanade des Invalides. And excuse my French. This started rather crucially with the installation of the interior and crafts objects, which were sent to Paris by train from Vienna in March 1925, accompanied by 9 students from the School of Applied Arts who were responsible for the installation, both conceptually and manually. Alfred Roller, professor at the Academy, attested later on, and I quote, "The whole exhibition in Paris was completed and furnished by 9 of our students. They completed the whole work by themselves, also the manual labor." Among them were at least 3 female students, recorded in the popular illustrated journal Wiener Bilder: the textile artist and designer Camilla Birke, the architect and ceramicist Christa Ehrlich, and the painter and tapestry artist Hilda Polsterer, who would remain in Paris after the exhibition, working as a painter, and she was also hired as the director of the Primavera Design Studios. Taking on the responsibility of furnishing the pavilion interiors with little more support than scaffolding, these women were hardly material wasting dilettantes, as Losset claimed. Taking a hands-on approach to their profession, dressed in workers' overalls, they publicly positioned themselves as skilled artisans who did not only create designs for different media, but also executed them. As indicated in the photograph circulating in Wiener Bilder, the painstaking work of painting all the vitrines, as well as completing the frescoes for the gentleman's room and the resting room of a lady, was completed by Birke, Ehrlich, and Polsterer, all 3 fresh graduates from the Academy of Applied Arts. But they were far from the only women represented, and in other areas too, women's contributions were significant. The Majolica stove in the gentleman's room, which I admit it's not a very good picture of it, was the centerpiece of the design. It was designed by Hertha Bucher, a ceramicist who later specialized in facade work. The metalwork in the religiously inspired Room of Silence included a large sculpture by Angela Stadtherr, one of few women specialized in metal sculpture. The frescoes and intarsia work in the niche of the resting room of a lady, which was first exhibited at the Museum of Design and Industry in Vienna in 1923, not only represented one of the defining features of this favorite room in press reports, it also indicated a new direction in fresco painting, which experienced a strong revival in Austria after the First World War. In addition to these contributions to the interiors of the Austrian pavilion, numerous other artists and craftswomen exhibited art and design objects, many of which were successful in winning prizes. Silver and bronze medals went to the ceramicist Susi Singer, for example, who had her own pottery studio in rural Austria, while also producing work for the Viennese workshops. The ceramicist and textile artist Hilda Jesser, artists Marianne Leisching and Fanny Haflinger, who would later found the feminist art association Wiener Frauenkunst, as well as the designers Mitzi Otten-Friedmann and Felice and Kitty Rix. In the international press, Austrian ceramics found particular mention, praising the modernizing impulses of adaptations of expressionist and cubist styles in the work of artists such as Singer and Wally Wieseltier. Yet, as is easy to see from the visual records of the exhibition, flamboyance, humor, and color defined not just the ceramics, but Austrian design overall, marking a radical difference from the sincerity of l'esprit nouveau celebrated elsewhere at the Expo and probably best known for Le Corbusier's designs. Austrian modern design, by contrast, eschewed the clarity and sincerity of functionalism and purism, and instead built on expressionist forms that emphasized individual craftsmanship rather than mass production. Developed predominantly by women artists who had trained at the Academy of Applied Arts and were often taught by Hoffmann. I don't want to deny that. Post-imperial Austrian design culture was by extension significantly shaped and defined by women's reinterpretations and updates of Fin de siècle designs by their teachers Hoffmann, Dagobert Becher, and Michael Powolny. Yet this is not at all how women's involvement nor the presentation of Austrian culture was perceived in the minds of critics at home who sought a different kind of Austrian identity. In line with the dismissive attitudes towards craftswomen in a wider cultural field, women's contributions were made responsible for the failures of the pavilion to provide modern practical solutions to Austrian design. A prime example for this is the art historian Max Ehrmer's lengthy review in the Viennese journal Der Tag, printed in June 1925. Ehrmers, a social democrat and a leading figure in driving forward socialist building projects in Vienna, begins by describing the pavilion, and I quote, as a pink craft object beneath the green leaves of the Cour de la Seine, which offers light, choice, and carefree existence as if one stood in front of the boudoir of a seductive woman. Rather than focusing on the pavilion as an expression of a rational modernity, Ehrmers emphasizes its playfulness, romanticizing the Paris location by the Seine for Viennese readers. Calling it Hoffmann's triumph, light, joys, and entertainment signal the architect's ability to create enticing building designs through place-specific updates on his long-established practice. By contrast, the interiors are seen much less favorably. Ehrmers notes, here, everyday objects are no longer produced with the seriousness, objectivity, and solidity to offer potential for mass consumption, but as entertaining and alluring things to help one to overcome the monotonous life of someone not having to rely on employment. Instead of seeing craftsmanship, the author criticizes undue attention paid to aestheticize decorative surfaces, describing them as the ideas of a femme fantaisiste, a fanciful woman with no sense of reality. Putting these flaws down to the new feminine character of Austrian design, Ehrmers sees the spirit of the male design geniuses of the older generation misinterpreted at the hands of the female students, the Kunstgewerblerinnen. The only remedy he finds for the rejuvenation of Austrian design is a shift towards, and I quote, a masculine, expert, serious, and well-constructed mass industry, adding on the need for a total reorganization of the Academy of Applied Arts. While the objects displayed in the Austrian pavilion were seen to harbor potential for profit-generating luxury expert goods, a notion repeated by Ehrmers and several other critics and politicians as well, they were thus deemed unfit to properly represent Austrian craftsmanship and identity. Their apparent femininity was thereby set on a par with the involvement of women designers, picked upon as those whose involvement transformed the triumph of master teachers such as Hoffmann into frivolous luxury objects, which were barely of any use. While these charges on the designs of the Wiener Werkstätte and the Academy of Applied Arts were not new, and I think most of us know that Adolf Loos in particular had already voiced them in the late years of the Habsburg Empire, they clearly gained a strongly gendered dimension with the proliferation of women designers after the First World War. In relation to the Austrian representation at the 1925 Paris Expo specifically, the strong representation of women artists was seen as a marker for the decadence of a time past, regardless of the fact that it was women rather than just their established male counterparts who brought new ideas to the exhibition. Ultimately, and in line with the role of the modern craftswoman as a contested figure in Austrian culture, Women's contribution to the Paris Expo was seen as significant only when emphasizing the pavilion's shortcomings in offering truly modern, meaning practical and functional design solutions. In moments of praise, it was the established pre-war generation of male artists who reaped the rewards. Beyond the gender bias such narratives emphasized, they also affected the presentation of a modern post-imperial Austrian identity. Rather than acknowledging the development that Viennese design had undergone with newly trained designers who emphasized an expressive and playful modernity, the attention paid to individual older established artists instead accentuated a sense of reminiscence for the innovations of the further siècle. On the one hand, this presentation manifested a sense of Habsburg nostalgia carried through by figures such as Hoffmann, as well as journalists such as Ermers and Bertha Zuckerkandl, who repeatedly emphasized the glory of the secession years. On the other hand, the definition of Austrian design by a lingering presence of glories past negated women's contributions to the field, in Paris as well as at home in Vienna. Rejecting this presentation of a metropolitan, colorful and playful approach to modernism as Austria's new design identity, a confident representation of post-imperial identity would only return with the radicalization of Austrian politics in the 1930s, delineated by Alpine-inspired designs, which we've already seen this morning. In Paris in 1925, a brief moment when women's contribution to Austrian design gained greater visibility, however, the gender bias irreverently attached to their designs rejected the mere possibility that this too could be what Austrian design represented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this brilliant talk that we have plenty of time to discuss after our second intervention. And I'm calling on stage Elisabetta Berezina, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of History, Central European University, with dissertation ongoing about, and I'm going to quote the title, Designed in Cities, Crafted in Villages, Soviet Crafts Policy 1932-1960. She's right now a visiting fellow at Leibniz Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung, Potsdam, and she's a teaching fellow at Global History Lab Project, which educates students around the world about the history of globalization and establishes international platform for learning skill development and students collaboration. Thank you for being here, and you're going to talk right now about the following topic: experts meet artisans planning for the Soviet crafts exhibition at the 1937 Paris World's Fair.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess this one. Thank you, Victor, for introducing me, and thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to present here in Paris, and I'm extremely excited about being here in this particular place and space where this really emblematic exhibition took place. And of course, I'm looking forward to our today's guided tour. And it's interesting to learn the place on our feet. And I guess, yeah, it's a great opportunity. And thank you, organizers, for doing it for all of us. Yeah, first of all, I need to say that, of course, this Paris Fair in 1937 was extremely spectacular international event of the interwar period. And on the slide, you can see this classic photo, which was reproduced multiple times to illustrate the symbolic confrontation of competing ideologies and to represent the political climate throughout Europe. And you see the Eiffel Tower stands between German and Soviet pavilions, which makes visible the confrontation between National Socialism, Stalinism, or Soviet Socialism, and Western capitalism. This is my yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this photo was used and sometimes even abused to illustrate, yeah, this competing politics. And because maybe of the striking symbolism of Paris skyline of 1947, it was a really attractive topic for many historians and art historians. So we have quite a lot of literature have been written about the pavilions and the architectures, its symbolic meaning, the sculpture on the top, for example, the Soviet pavilion made by Vera Muchina. But we know relatively little about what was actually exhibited in this pavilion, what kind of exposition, what kind of things were presented there. And actually it's quite interesting for me to know even why there is no official catalog in Russian libraries, for example. It's really like covered topic, and it's extremely difficult to find some information about how this exhibition was organized, actually. And for my today's presentation, I will be focusing on preparatory work being done to select exhibit for a particular part of this exposition in the Soviet pavilion, and it's a Department of Arts and Crafts. It's kind of general term, which sometimes I will be using. And I'm concentrating actually on what was going on in the shadow of this colossal pavilion. And I guess that this contemplation and still work in progress, but I'm already ready to share with you some ideas and preliminary discoveries. I guess it will help us to understand what role crafts played in Soviet self-representation abroad and for domestic audience too. And we have already heard a lot today about the role of crafts, and we have questions how this kind of art could actually exist in the Soviet state in the 30s. And I hope that with my presentation today, I will try to make it a bit clearer. I also need to say that in 1937, Soviet Union was also celebrating the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution. So this year marked with many, many layers of meanings. Yeah, we also can think about the Stalinism purge and Great Terror. So for Soviet historians, this year is really symbolically burdened, and there is lots of meanings behind. But yeah, today we will be talking mostly about crafts and how they were organized and collected for this particular exhibition. And the very same year, 1937, was marked with a quite relatively unmarked jubileum of university. The Scientific Research Institute of the Art Industry celebrated its 5th anniversary. And this institute was formed in 1932. It was transformed from Kustar Moscow Museum, and thanks to Mira for already introduced the museum to the audience. It's really much easier to talk about the Kustar crafts in the Soviet Union after her presentation, and I can not pay so much attention to. You have already the idea how these crafts could look like, and you have at least some understanding what kind of crafts were present in the Soviet Union during the time. So the institute was transformed from the Kustar Museum, and the Kustar Museum became a department of the institute. And we can say that the institute became the head organization to support, to consult, and to navigate different craft workshops all around the Soviet Union. So it was a kind of think tank located in Moscow, who were the institute, and the member of the institute were in charge of supervising crafts all around the Soviet Union. And there are different and really specific terminologies that we can use for describe this sort of crafts. For example, and you heard it already from Mira, Kustar craft, and Kustar is closer to cottage industry, some small scale production located in rural areas, but artisans, Kustars mostly produce these crafts for sale to the cities. And we also have this concept of folk craft or folk art, which extremely close to Kustar crafts, but in some sense and it was also emphasized in Mira's presentation, folk craft is something produced for local use. But actually, it's difficult to say whether there were real folk craft in the Soviet Union after 1920s. And among the different things that we can include in this concept of folk craft are different carpets, lace, lacquer boxes, really famous type of specific Soviet craft, lacquer craft, embroidery, wood, ivory, carving, yellow, or wood painting. And on the slide, you can see some highlights. There were different sorts of crafts, but I guess you can even know something from it, or kind of recognize, because in souvenir shops in Russia, if you've been there, you still can find something like that. And these crafts were often represented and introduced as something natural or traditional, long established. And the crafts were also presented as typical for certain settlements, and craft production had really close connection with a rural area, local materials. And in Soviet texts, you can see it easily that they were kind of emphasizing that these crafts are connected to the local nature. And of course, those kinds of crafts could be also produced by amateur painters, by folk people who had their enormous creativity to be somehow showed in their creative handwork. But in fact, many of those crafts were reinvented during the 1920s and 1930s. The craft art tales and workshops were supervised from the center and curated by art historians and professional artists. And it's part of the story where a scientific research institute of the art industry played an extremely important role. And the Scientific Research Institute of art industry also was involved in different activities that we can call material cultural diplomacy. First of all, they were preparing exhibits for international exhibitions. And I put some exhibitions on the list, and you see that here you can also see the first exhibition in 1925, because again, the museum and the followed institutes, they were closely connected. So we can even say that there were two different institutes. We can consider them also together. And I also put on the slide some folk and artistic industries associations. Maybe it will help you to figure out what kind of activities were implemented by the institute, because after the war in the social bloc, let's say, other very familiar in functions institutions were founded. And you can see that in Czech Republic, in Poland, in Romania, some kind of associations was formed to supervise crafts in different regions. And the art, the NIHP, or this art industrial institute, they were doing quite the same. Yeah, and for the Paris Exposition 1937, the idea was to present the progress that Soviet Union made for these 20 years, through these 20 years after the revolution. And we can think also about the function of craft and folk arts in the exposition. There was like extremely little photos from the pavilions interiors, but on this not really nice reproduction, you can still guess that there is a big panel above, and on this panel you can see from the postures of the dancing people that this panel represents different dances of local nationals, from different parts of the Soviet Union. On the left, I can guess some Slavs are dancing there. In the middle, we can guess also, even with this really bad reproduction, some Caucasus people who are dancing their traditional dances, and maybe on the right, it's barely recognizable, but I guess maybe some Asian people are represented here. So again, we have this idea of folks and different nationals represented again in this interior of the pavilion. But it might be even easier to represent different folks with their materials, with material culture. And that's why material crafts and artistic crafts were used to show the traditions, the artistic traditions of different people within the Soviet Union. And the Institute was entrusted with this task to collect the exhibits from different workshops and to prepare them to display at the exhibition. And on the slides, you can see a really rare photo of this connection between experts who were members of the Institute and artisans who were working in rural area. And this particular slide, you see members of Stora Artel. It's a small village now in Vladimirska Oblast in Russia. And Stora painters were creating so-called lacquer boxes, lacquer painting. And if you have a question why you can see only men on a photo, actually those lacquer painters formerly were, formerly were icon painters, and icon painting is predominantly male occupation. And interestingly enough, you can distinguish and see there are two representatives of the Institute. Vasilenko Victor, who was an art historian, he stands the second from the left, and also a man who is recognized in the photo as a head of the Institute, Karablov Alexander, but I'm not sure whether it's the right name on the photo, but it was so in the archive. For now, let's trust this identification. And all other men are artisans of this artel. And what Institute actually did, so they are organizing different sorts of consultations for the artisans, and it might be really different sorts of consultation. For example, technical guiding, how to, how to make the production process more effective, how to, for example, if we're talking about lacquer boxes, how to mechanize some processes, to make it easier for artisan, for example, to make the flat more ready to painting. We can also think about artistic guidance, because the members of the Institute were consulting artisans in terms of what to paint, what kind of imagery are appropriate, what kinds of imagery are appropriate for the reproduction and for painting on the lacquer boxes. And sometimes it was a mutual, maybe, creativity among the artisan and experts. And of course, there was still some space for creativity from the side of artisans, but they were also often consulted. What's appropriate to paint in a particular period, because Soviet ideology and propaganda was changing quite quickly, and artisans were receiving some really vague guidance from the officials, and they often addressed to the Institute what exactly should we paint, because we can't decode this vague propaganda. They were not talking about it as a propaganda actually, but we can't decode this vague guidance. Please tell us what we can actually paint. And on the slide, the next slide, you can see one of the examples. Like, I guess it's a sort of this mutual creativity that can exist, and its result. So it was created, I guess, especially for the Paris exhibition in 1937, because in the center you can see Notre Dame, and the whole imagery, it's kind of illustration to Gargantua in the episode with the bells of Notre Dame. And I guess, so there is still no documents behind this particular piece, but we can guess that it was created in sort of consultation between the experts of the Institute, and in this case, Salabanov Vasily, who was a painter and artisan from Palech, very famous center of icon painting previously, and then lacquer painting in the Soviet Union. But of course, there were also many arts and crafts in this folk artistic craft, as they were called lately, where females were predominantly occupied. For example, lace making, it was female occupation. Also, different sorts of painting and wood carving. And on the slide, you have these model photos of female artisans creating something. And on the left, there is some examples of lace with Soviet imagery. You see tractors here, right? On all the three lace borders. And these borders and the patterns were created by students of Volga Technical Lace School. And they were proudly demonstrated in all the exhibition during the 30s. And this sort of imagery was also explained by the Institute. So now in the Soviet Union, artists and artisans, they don't need to create any fairy tales imagery, because previously in crafts, and we can see it also in the exhibition of 1925, these fairy tales and some unrealistic fantasy were commonplace and common topic for painting. But now we have this Soviet themes, and this Soviet reality is already a fairy tale. It was a common trope in Soviet narratives about crafts. But actually, there is a kind of inconsistency here, because 1937, again, it's another anniversary. It was a year of commemoration of Pushkin deaths, and that's why, again, the fairy tales was sneaked into to this imagery of crafts. And on the slide, you can see Neil's a set of different spoons, and I guess there were also sometimes small glasses with Pushkin's fairy tales as imagery for different tools, which people can use in their everyday life. So it's again this discrepancy between the official narrative and how it was explained for the public. And what can we see in fact being exhibited in the exposition? Because it's also emphasized sometimes that people like from abroad, international public, couldn't understand the ideas behind some propaganda imagery because they're too far from it. And while Soviet imagery was proudly demonstrated in internal exhibition, for international exhibitions, mostly fairy tales was used. And then after the war, when crafts were transformed again into more, kind of souvenir production, again, fairy tales became the majority, like the major topic for painting. Okay, and on this map, I would like also to show you briefly, it's quite inaccurate because I haven't put all the workshop on the map, but just to have this idea how based was activities of the Institute. So the Institute organized short trips to different art tales throughout the Soviet Union, from Kamchatka to West Ukraine, from south to north, and all around the Soviet Union. Their experts were traveling in order to consult, in order to show some patterns sometimes. So the idea was to research traditional patterns in different places and then to transform it again with some understanding how it should be and to get them back to the artisans. And sometimes here I have to switch to the very beginning with my slide. Sometimes it was also used for justifying some territorial claims. I just want to bring this example up because it's really telling. For example, after the annexation of Eastern Polish territories, again, the sort of short trip was organized to new Western Ukrainian territories, and they spent a month there collecting and researching objects. And after that, the report was made by the head of this trip. I forgot the name, like exhibition, and the trip. It's help me, please. Like I mean, it's like ethnographic expedition. Yeah. So after the expedition, the report was made, and during this report, the head of it claimed that from studying these different forms of traditional crafts in Western Ukraine, we can say that they're too close to general Ukrainian crafts and South Russian crafts. And with this rhetoric, the territorial claims were justified, and kind of unification of different people and folks inside the Soviet Union was justified. So it was already here, this story of using materials and material crafts for following different political and ideological goals. Yeah, sometimes, of course, there were conflicts between artels and experts, but sometimes experts were even called to come and to guide the artisans. For example, some representatives of Dagestan artel, traditional one from Untitled, who are working on decorated wood. They call for representatives of the institute to come and to show what kind of goods could be produced and which forms of imagery are the most kind of welcomed, and what they can do actually. And sometimes it was the institute who initiated the trips and consultations. Sometimes it might be even artisans themselves. And on the slide again you can see a representative of this artel, but again very picturesque in the traditional costumes. And I wonder why they have so kind of not really happy faces. And on the other slides or photos from the same series, the faces are almost tragic. They're posing with these traditional costumes. So, and from sources, we can reconstruct a short, let's say, instruction that was used by the Institute to collect the exhibits. It's not universal one, I should say, but it might be converted and some steps might be added. For example, first of all, it was important to contact local administration, and it means that before organizing the trip, the representative of the institute should go to, or like should connect with local party administration or production administration. Then he or she is supposed to make on-site visits and communicate with artisans in artel, collect some information about workshop or artel. Then it was necessary to examine the exhibits, to make descriptions and so-called passports for each model that they have. They also made some photographs, but it's still difficult to find them in archives, and I guess they're in the museum, but they should exist somewhere. The seventh step and the next step was packing and dispatching the items, because yeah, you've seen already the map, and it's quite big territory, and they had to pay some time to make the safe packing. After all the formalities, the artisans also became money for their products. And when the researcher, the member of the institute, came back to Moscow, he or she had also make some research, additional research with like by using again the library of the institute, and in ideal situation it should even end with a publication. And for example, after the exposition of 1937, the big volume was published about folk national crafts in the Soviet Union. But again, because of the war, the plan for publication was kind of disturbed, because initially they planned to publish several volumes on different sorts of crafts, but finally the only one volume was published, and it focused mostly on Russian territory, so on Russian Soviet Republic, and in this volume you can't see any information about crafts from National Republic of the Soviet Union. And I would say that the human factor was extremely important, of course, in this form of communication, when members of the Institute were traveling all around the Soviet Union, contacting with artisans and contacting with administrations. And of course, from this sort of personal communication, the whole success of the story depend. And for the Institute, it was also quite important time from preparing this exposition, because they prepared for two expositions, actually, for the Paris one and for one in the Soviet Union in Tretyakov Gallery. So they trying to hit as many aims and to catch as many rabbits as possible by producing this sort of instruction for their members, and to creating the system of supervising the workshops. But was also important, the idea that the Institute existed in extremely competitive atmosphere of late 30s, because many other stakeholders wanted to supervise crafts, because it was an easy way to collect, to get money, actually, because it was still important in the Soviet Union to have this base to sell crafts, and then to become money from it, and to spend it money for further research or artistic production. And Institute made everything quite successfully. And I can say that as a result of the activities before the exposition, they created a big fund of different materials that they then used as models or prototypes for further reproduction. They collected photographs and they published a book. They also established this system of supervising and contacting the workshops. And actually, the preparation for this exhibition helped them a lot in establishing their authority as a main center of supervising crafts in the Soviet Union. Yeah, I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm sure both your talks, discussing both arts and crafts, but in a very different approach, raised questions among the public and the participant. I see two questions, or three. Camille, you have the right to pick the first one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talks, both of them. I guess my question would be that the focus has been very much on production. But who are these things produced for? And I was particularly thinking about your example, the Soviets examples, Elizabeth, where I'm thinking, well, who would have been able to afford these things? Because obviously most people wouldn't, because they were quite intricate, and I don't know how much they cost, but obviously I can imagine that they wouldn't have been cheap. And it's the same, I think, with the Wiener Werkstätte. Well, we know, don't we? The problem is that it's a bit like arts and crafts in the 19th century. They didn't even think about marketability in a way, which is why they went bust. But I just wonder, it would be generally, did they have a concept of the consumer even?
Okay, would you like to start?
Yes, you're right, obviously, and the Wiener Werkstätte went bust in 1932, not too long after, and it was definitely an idealistic endeavor, I guess, and the thing is, some of the criticism is certainly true of the objects, that they were maybe not very practical, they couldn't be produced in big batches, they were directed to a very specific clientele. So what I would criticize more is the fact that the criticism of it was so gendered. But it was an elite product. But I think especially in Paris, the idea was also to market that to a Parisian market. And if you look at artists like Hilda Polsterer, I mean, she got her job in Paris. She stayed on, and the Primavera design company, she would produce all kinds of ceramics for them, furnishings and so on. So there was definitely a market for it. Just maybe not quite in line with the times of mass production. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as for Soviet case, so yeah, it's really important question, who were actually the audience, customers for such kinds of crafts. And again, it's difficult to answer in one sentence, because, for example, during the 20s, crafts were a ready-made market in Europe, and even the special, it's a special agency for sell crafts, Kust Export. Yeah, Kust, you already recognize this, Kustar in it. It was formed to sell only artistic crafts abroad, and they had connection with the US, the UK, also with France, I guess, and Germany. And for example, lace was sold to England, I guess. And during that time, still from this interest to Russian culture, from revolutionary time, it was used a lot by the Soviets because it was a source of currency for them. But then in the middle of the 30s, when this international market actually collapsed, they tried to, again, rethink the production and started to produce different sorts of items inside the same workshop. And it was so-called mass-produced crafts, or like mass-produced goods inside of the same crafts. Yeah, for example, some easy, simple forms with easy paintings on it. And it might be sold in relatively low price, right? But there were also other types of products that were mostly planned for museums or for diplomatic gifts, or for some kind of like present or prize when, for example, for some competition, people, and for this social competition inside of different working communities. These kind of projects were mostly also kind of bought by the government itself, by the state, and then reintroduced inside the Soviet Union. And of course, it also it was necessary to create a special unit in each of the artel who can, and this unit should consist of mostly of kind of advanced painters who can do a better or creative works. And it was actually an important thing to divide the artists who are doing mass-produced items and who are doing some sort of creative works for the state, for the museums, for prizes, for gifts.
I thank you for two very, very interesting talks. My question is for Yulia. You were very clear that there was a great deal of criticism of the work. I think it was the failure was the women, the success was the men. And I have a question of two parts for that, which is, what did Hoffmann and Hertel say about these works? And what did they say about the criticism of these works?
There is this episode on Hoffmann. It's written by an American young student of his Gewerbeschule, which talks about how he doesn't say very much, and his sign of support was to send students there. But that he wouldn't even speak to the students. He had Hertel. He would speak in third person about them, and then Hertel would tell the students. So I don't think there was any kind of defense, or what I guess approval by him was the fact that they were involved in it. But there is this very famous episode where Adolf Loos, this was slightly after the exhibition, I think it was in 1927, where Adolf Loos, who of course always gave those huge public lectures that always caused outrage because they were always more extreme than they definitely needed to be, but where he really attacks the Kunstgewerbeschule, and that ends in a big fight between Hoffmann and Loos. So he stands up for the Kunstgewerbeschule as the project that he was so involved in from the very beginning. But I think as far as those specific attacks against the gendered nature of it goes, I haven't found anything. I mean, this is also something that I was hoping to find, to have maybe a more positive view of them as well. But that's what really struck me. It was the silence, that you had those attacks, and anything that was positive then didn't say, oh yeah, it was those women who were really, really great. That was more if it was about specific ceramicists in different contexts. So it's not to say that they weren't positively mentioned, but not in those national representation projects. And I mean, there's always the thing that always hangs over that is, of course, the fact that many of them were of Jewish heritage, and that they were written out, that they were erased because they didn't match that. And that is, it's never there in those criticisms, in the popular press. But I think that there is this implicit sense of the rich woman consumer that is tied to that very identity, that then could be very easily used by more reactionary forces. But I think even in the press where it's not explicitly mentioned, and I mean, Hoffmann in that, as we've very recently seen in different exhibitions, and Ilana Shapiro is doing some work on that at the moment, he's not an unproblematic person in that sense as well, because he was very successful between 38 and 45, and then after that too. So I don't know what his position would be within that, but yeah.
Or a bar brawl?
I don't know about the bar brawl. It was in the press.
Oh,
yeah. You can follow it on Anno.
Thank you. I have a question for Elisabetta. You mentioned, maybe it's a redundant question, sorry if you have already mentioned. You mentioned that the local authorities made the first choice where to go and yeah, to visit the workshop and so on and so on. Could you follow or trace back this kind of discussions on the specific workshop, which to visit, which is the direction to follow? And the question would be whether this kind of decisions and choices represent some kind of local identity or regional identity of this place, and whether this kind of identity represents kind of distance or proximity to the political center, also you know, respecting also this kind of administrative units within the Soviet Union, different political and administrative dependencies like oblasts and Soviet republics and so on and so on. So that would be mine.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the questions. If we'll talk about this idea of contacting with a local administration, I think it was made because the Institute had to establish and to maintain contacts with really like lots of workshops, and this idea to introduce local administration as a, let's say, mediator between the institute and the workshop was just mostly because, first of all, they can collect some information from the administration, for example, whether there are some workshops already established in the region, or are there any individual custars or masters who are working there with whom the institute can connect. And of course, it was also another tool to, let's say, to have some like yeah, to have some power, yeah, about these artisans and local artists. So I guess this administration was used just kind of mechanism, yeah, to make, for example, to make the workshop work faster, because they asked the local administration to support the institute and all the endeavors they are planning to do in the region, but actually they were not, sometimes they were not like chosen, but provide some information about local opportunities, let's say. And you mentioned it absolutely right, and it's clever consideration that of course it has something with regional identities, and even inside, like, or in Russian Socialist Republic, there are different national autonomous republics or national regions, and of course it was important for the institute to create this yeah, really mosaic of different nationalities, yeah, living together in sort of friendship, as it was mostly discussed and introduced in the ideological texts and narratives. And this local identity, I guess it's still underrepresented and under-researched, but it was important because even through the materiality itself, I guess, yeah, we were talking, Vladislav told us and about the agency of materiality, yeah, and it also played a role here because these costar crafts were produced from local materials in many cases. But sometimes, yeah, it was also a complicated story. For example, from those artists from Dagestan, they sometimes had lack of metal ware to make the unsukul wooden decorated crafts. And it's also interesting how all these ideas of materiality being local and this importance of producing things from local materials plays with identities, yeah, of the artists.
Next one is Marta.
I will be short. Thank you for your thoughts. I've learned a lot. I have a question for Elisaveta. I was just wondering, do we know how was the reaction on this exposition from the part of Russian artists in Paris, Russian immigrant community? I was thinking, for instance, on Maria Chernisheva and Talashkino school, but she was in this time already dead, but I think there were many others. So,
yeah, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have any answer to it, but already, for example, Mira introduced me to some photographer who was photographing the exhibits during the exhibition of 1925, and it's some sort of problem with the following exhibition in this 1937, because, for example, we have no records of kind of audience, yeah, ideas about what it was from the Soviet part, and I haven't been researching the audience reactions here in France, but it would be really interesting, and of course maybe I should also look into this direction. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Right. Well, thank you, and I think it worked really well as a closing panel as well, because it brought up the agency very well, the topic. So my kind of comment question goes this way, because you both talked about these agents that in a certain respect became invisible for different reasons, or were always invisible, whether they were kind of, I don't know, just part of Hoffman's circle, or they were kind of brought in by the institute or the different groups. But I'm kind of wondering, do we hear any voices from these agents? I mean, do we know any reactions from the women, from the actual craftsmen? Did they get to go to Paris at all? I know you didn't mention that a bit, but yeah, did they have any voice?
Yeah. I can see.
As concerns specifically that exhibition, I'm not sure. I haven't come across one, but yeah, but generally, of course, there is writing. I mean, Vali Wieseltier, the ceramicist, she writes, and I guess some of them also have a voice through teaching later. So there is a sort of extended presence, and I guess the point of showing how they were made invisible, it just seems so contradictory based on the fact that many of them were quite successful after. Yeah, but specifically to the 25 exhibition, I don't know. And I even don't know, I mean, I suppose with Polsterer, now mentioning her again, I mean, she had some connections before because that's how she got the job, and that's how, so there was a bigger network involved in that, certainly. And then you had, they would organize themselves in ceramics workshops and so on. But in terms of a written response, I'm not sure.
In itself interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have almost the same answer. I'm not sure, because sometimes, yeah, it was kind of practice that when artisans were invited to demonstrate their skills during the exhibitions, and I guess it was a case for domestic exhibitions, first of all. Also, for example, for Paris exhibition in 1925, it was a case that some maybe artisans were present or somewhere near pavilions or in the pavilions, but again, I'm not sure. But yeah, it might be the case because it was a case for domestic exhibitions.
Yes, I thank you both for your wonderful papers. I've been really interested thinking today, and partly something that, well, Sam's paper about Kiralfy, and I was thinking, why are the things that he's doing, why do they feel rather different in a way from some of the other things that we've talked about for these last 2 days? And I think there's something around the fact that he's not worried about sort of verisimilitude or sense of truth and representing something that's kind of out there. He's, in a sense, you know, able to kind of indulge in a kind of self-referencing, the kind of hyper reality that almost, to me, looks like Disney, that doesn't actually necessarily have to represent what's happening in the real world. So he's not attached to those kinds of ideas. By contrast, I was thinking about the seriousness with which, you know, in your paper, Elisabetta, you know, the seriousness with which these representations of the world are happening. And then again, I was thinking about it because of these fairy tales, but fairy tales within, you know, very much within a kind of sense of what's a true representation of that culture. So kind of, you know, restricted. And so I guess my question is, you know, does truth matter in these situations? Is that what it's all about?
Yeah, fairy tales matter, I can say, because I guess it's still a facade that Soviets would like to show for the international public, because even if we see that really seriously done exposition of arts and craft to represent these multiple nations living together, we can think about the year 1937, the year of national purge too. So it's really, you know, facade, it's a Disneyland, as you said, a fairy tale in which people, yeah, would like to believe and would like others to believe too. So I guess truth, yeah, it's not close to what was done for the exhibition.
Can I add something? I was thinking about this in terms of the photographs that I showed of the women on the scaffolding. And that obviously, I mean, that was in a very glossy popular paper and circulated, and you could only see the women in those overalls. So there is, I guess, I mean, this is more about sensationalism because it's about, oh, our nice girls from the academy are also doing that kind of stuff, but it's only a picture with a little subheading. There's no more context to it. It's just a picture. So I guess there is this, maybe that's attached to this idea of modernity. We now even have women who do that, but no showing of any of the hardship or the actual work that has to go in it. And then once that's up, it just goes away again. So it's about this moment of showmanship in a way too.
Can I just add a comment to follow on really from Harriet's observation? And I suppose it is related to methodology, because I remember a few years ago attending a conference where somebody was speaking about the discovery of Tatar folk art, you know, by Soviet archaeologists in the 1930s, and she was very concerned to sort of say, you know, look how carefully they documented all these artifacts and so forth. And I remember asking her at the time, saying, well, but this was at the time that Stalin was deporting the Tatars and killing, you know, tens of thousands of them. You know, how did they square that? How did they account for that? And what was interesting was that the particular speaker, she really struggled. She couldn't quite understand what I was trying to get at. You know, what was most important for her was simply noting the way that the Tatar folk culture was being collected without a sense of that. Well, maybe a kind of what was going on in one sense of you know how you might interpret that and the meaning of that. I suppose I don't know if that it was just something that occurs to me now, but it is that I do sort of worry, I suppose, when yeah, this whole issue of the you know the discovery of folk culture in how it's discovered and mobilized just at the moment that governments are also wiping out the people that produce it, you know. And what, you know, it invites a certain cynicism, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's not a question, but very elaborated and nice comment that adds a lot also to general picture. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
Well, if I may, a follow-up comment to Matthew. I'm wondering if the exploration of folk culture was also used to divide people, to somehow say, oh, no, you don't actually belong to the ethnic group that you think you belong to. Ethnographically, we can see that you are separate, and then suddenly they are not part of that larger group. Did that also happen? The example I'm thinking of is Austria-Hungary and the Ruthenians, who could have been Ukrainian if they were born on the other side of the border, but they become these invented Ruthenians.
Yeah, I guess we can consult with those historians who are studying ethnography, as also sphere of scientific research in the Soviet Union. But in their activities of the Scientific Research Institute of the art industry, I didn't meet something like that. So they were doing some research, but they don't try to, let's say, mark some particular communities as like national or excluded from it. So I haven't seen something like that. I guess, it may be closer to ethnographic work or some ethnographic research, but the particular institute, they were something in between, like art history, even technology of crafts, and a sort of ethnography, of course, because they were studying local settlements and local like small villages, but ethnography wasn't their main let's say, not the main subject.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It apparently provoked a lot of questions. And I have a follow-up too, because we just can't omit the larger political context of the whole thing. And the ethnographic work seems to be very much driven by the Pan-Slavic ideas, how to support the huge Slavic nation under the strong dictatorship, and the oppressed, the workers, the silent people. Who were they? Were they loyal, or were they the oppressed to be killed soon afterwards? Who were those people? And I just want to ask if you just by chance haven't run into some material, if the presence at the World Fair couldn't be a path out of Soviet Union, if some of those people couldn't take it as an opportunity to leave and stay, because your graph about packing the exhibit and unpacking it, I guess packing was in Soviet Union and unpacking was in Paris, but who did it? What did it mean for those people who were the workers on the site?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know almost nothing about the workers on site. Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting how the exhibits traveled actually from one place to another. For example, it was a problem for export, yeah, not for exhibition, but for export sellings. Some types, I just remember an example that some types of wood cracked during like shipment process. And it's again not people who are presented in this archival sources, but materiality and objects. And yeah, so I can say little about people who were packing and unpacking, but something about the shipment and how materiality was suffering during that. And you asked also about workers themselves being suppressed, yeah, in the first part of your.
If it could be a way of emigration for some of them.
Yeah, also interesting thing, because, for example, of Palech artisans or artists, they were invited to Italy after the Paris exhibition in 1925. They were invited, but by Italian, so maybe it's a legend or kind of myth, Soviet myth, because it was said and reproduced also multiple articles about the crafts that they were invited to establish a new school in Italy. But of course, so the authorities said, no, it's our artisans and we need to keep them like where they live, because yeah, again, this importance of local nation, rural area, and like tradition that they have to maintain in their workshop. So there is yeah, no way to escape. But maybe this stories are just uncovered. It's a good question, yeah, and interesting to discuss it further.
Thank you very much for both of these talks. They're really very insightful and really a lot of fun to see these two directions that crafts took within a very short period of time. I have a question for Julia, and I have to say I was totally shocked at your presentation, because we just in Germany, we just came from the Bauhaus year in 2019, where, you know, solid Bauhaus for a year. So we looked at the Bauhaus again. My question is, what were the, you know, was there any connection between this moment at the Wiener Werkstatt and in Germany, what was going on, and also gender politics? But the reason why I was so shocked was at the Bauhaus in Weimar and in Dessau, where they still had the wall painting workshops, that was the most male-dominated workshop at all, because you had to be tall and strong to spend all day on a scaffolding painting. So it was so wonderful just to see the work here being done by women. It was also the coolest place to go, because through dissolving the wall through imagery, you could create another spatial reality. So that was sort of this intellectual as well as physical argument, while women could not go into it. And of course, all the painters then were like Kandinsky and whatever, were very interested in working with this workshop as well. So first of all, it was wonderful to see that an absolute other reality in Vienna at this point in time. And were there any connections at all, or did they really want to distance themselves? Of course, through Gropius and Alma Mahler, there is this Vienna connection early on, but could you just talk about, was there any connection or purposeful distance? Thank you.
I guess the early connection that you mean is probably Itten, who was in Vienna before, and then he went to the Bauhaus. After Maria Likatz-Strauss, she taught in Freiburg at the... Yeah, but to the Bauhaus specifically, I mean, there is this, there's some Zizek students who then go, the most famous one being Friedel Dicker Brandeis. But otherwise, in terms of connections, there is the Wiener Werkstatt, the catalog that I showed, and there are comparisons in it about specific departments and the organization of teaching. But I can't recall that there is a sort of closer connection to it. Maybe more to the, when we talked about the Bratislava, it's not the Bratislava Bauhaus, the School of Arts and Crafts in Bratislava, there were more regular connections through individuals like Leopold Wolfgang Rochowanski, who was very involved with the school in Vienna and the school in Bratislava. And he had a letter exchange with Oskar Schlemmer. So I think, but they're very, I don't think they're bigger institutional links, or not that I know of, but through individuals, some. And with the fresco painting, the interesting thing about it is I think that in Austria, I would say it's more the conservative side, because of course, the example that I showed was Vienna being the more progressive part, but there was a group of artists who went to Salzburg and were closely related to the Salzburg Festival, which is this conservative Catholic modernism in a way. And there you had Anton Feistauer, who was also a member of the Klimt group before, and I don't know his first name now, Harter, who were deeply Catholic, and they wanted to renew Austrian art there. And they were also there was a separate Salzburg Werkbund as well, and they would create quite a bit of fresco painting. Then there were many women involved, but it was never on the progressive side of things. It's a kind of a conservative version of it.
We had many questions, interesting ones. Thank you for those efforts connecting the papers, and was really well conceived, and it worked very well, this panel. Thank you very much. I invite you. Thank you to all of you. I have some kind of, it's not a fairy tale, but the expression was used, so I'm reusing it right now. Just a little story before we come to the conclusion, which is not a proper conclusion, as you can imagine. How can I possibly try to sum up everything that has been said during those 2 rich days? And also sometimes I need to take care of the croissant and gastronomic problems that happen when you organize such a thing. So you need to be both in and out of the conference. We navigated among worlds, methodologies. So let's take a boat together. I'm just gonna go back to that story I've been studying a couple of years ago now, but I find it so fascinating. Plus it relates to the 1939 World's Fair in New York. The world of tomorrow, that was the punchline, like the slogan of the fair, which is terribly ironical. In 1939, the world of tomorrow. Boats, because the French pavilion, designed by Roger-Henri Expert and Pierre Patou, looks a little bit like, you know, a liner or some kind of paquebot boat of the time. A pavilion in which many things were displayed, usual national pavilion style. Gastronomy was on display as well, folklore, traditions. The question of truth that you raised, it was really a really deep comment, and it really strikes me each time I hear conferences about those national pavilions, because where is truth? What is truth? What is authenticity? Is always a question that rises in my mind, and remains most of the time unanswered. But those exhibitions are fascinating by the fact that they raise that question, which is also a very important question that we deal with as historians, I guess, truth and authenticity. So here are a few images of that pavilion, that well-known pavilion, well-known event. So we're not here with a neglected narratives of, I don't know, new nations. We're like with that French imperialist way of displaying itself. It's a very powerful pavilion, and still many things remain to be said about it. I've been browsing lots of archives about it, and for instance, just on the way I'm mentioning this, that those panels that were advertising the works made in French national museums, designed by Laure Albin-Guillot, photographer, and she designed those panels, and I'm trying to find more information about those displays without really a lot of success because sources are very few. So I'm just showing this on the way to this boat story I'm going to tell you about. So the French Pavilion in 1939 in New York displays that huge exhibition whose title is 5 Centuries of History Mirrored in 5 Centuries of French Art. And this fine arts exhibition that happens in the pavilion gathered important pieces of French painting, French sculpture, and decorative art as well, and involved not only the national public collections, and I'm talking here the Louvre Museum and many other museums in other cities of France, but also a lot of private galleries that were collaborating with the state to promote their own items and artifacts and so on. And this is another agency thing, that the collaboration between the public and the private, which sounds very contemporary, but in fact in the interwar years, it was really, really usual, even in the late 19th century, that galleries in the field of fine arts would collaborate with such events. So all that you can see is in the paratext and the little advertisings, the brochures that aren't always well cataloged, but still are rich of information about those hidden agencies. Brummer, Wildenstein, Devine, those big galleries were lending works of art for such displays that really interested me for a while. I was astonished that nothing was really written about this, but that's how the French history mirrored in French art exhibition was made. They really displaced castles, interiors, ensembles, recreated them in a strange mashup with real and fake, where again with the problem of truth and authenticity. Bringing paintings from Versailles, you can see here on the left, bringing Sébastien Bourdon and other paintings taken from private galleries. And I was working on how those objects were actually brought to the other side of the Atlantic and started working on a transportation issue. This is again another field that the exhibition history is opening, is the logistical aspects, and this remained kind of this was a common thread, I guess, among all the contributions. And I want to just point it out that this very pragmatic way of looking at how things migrate in a really very clunky sense, literal sense. I mean, so here's the boat. It's called the Paris, liner Paris. Very famous liner, contemporary artists contributed, decorated the dining room and so on, very chic. And it was supposed to bring all of those objects from all those museums and galleries to New York. And this happened in 1939. In the summer, the ship is on fire and sinks at the harbor of Le Havre, right before, the day before it was supposed to depart to New York. The problem was not the Gestapo or not radical leftists like some of the press clippings here can say or try to investigate. The problem was that the baker made a mistake. He was probably doing baguettes and so whatever. The kitchen caught fire and the boat sank. You can see here the cranes trying to save whatever could be saved, but the catastrophe happened. It looks like, you can find a couple of videos, it looks like a Werner Herzog movie of some sort. And the ship sinks and everybody's in complete state of panic, right? The whole French heritage that was supposed to be gloriously displayed in New York is now under the water at the harbor of Le Havre. So another agency here, I guess the baker's agency or the baguette agency. But what I mean here, using stupid jokes, is that the human factor, right? Is there such thing as a world without a human factor? But using that expression really invites us to point out neglected human beings involved in the history of those exhibitions. Yeah, the good thing about that story is that, I mean, 2 people or 3 people died, many firemen trying to save the boat and save other people caught in the boat. Most of the crates with the artworks were actually unloaded during the panic, and due to some delays, some of the artworks weren't there on time and were saved because they weren't trapped in the boat. Still, I went through the archives here at the Archives Nationales. I went to the Archives Départementales de la Seine-Maritime to look at the police report and so on. Such things that as an art historian, I thought I would never do. That's where art exhibition and exhibition history leads you to, like archives you had no idea about. Interesting. So I found those documents here mentioning one crate of containing 2 sculptures from the Louvre that sank with the boat. A bust by Carpeaux, a bust by Coisevaux, some medals, and some other objects related, of course, to the French-American relationships. To see the irony again, how this event was actually symbolical in the end. It's very pragmatical, logistical, but there's symbol always in it. So those objects are gone, they're lost. In fact, the Coisevaux that you see on the right vanished. We have no idea where this is. I found in other archives that German soldiers during the war, when France was occupied and the boat still underwater, visited the boat because Jewish people were trying to go to America in that period, and they were interested in finding goods and valuables in the boat. It's a terrible story. The Carpeaux bust on the left has been found in 1951 while they were renewing the harbor, and they took care of the shipwreck. It is now on display at the Orsay Museum, which I found really really crazy. It spent like 10 years of its life under the water and never attended the exhibition it was supposed to be at. So yeah, another neglected narrative, another agency. Like everybody talks about those 2 sculptures because they're very prestigious. Georges-Henri Rivière, who was running the Folk Art Museum, I don't know how to translate it, lost around 25 crates of folkloric items from, we can see here, trompette en faïence de Vergne, local stuff from the south of France, dresses, clothes. And he was really the saddest curator of a museum you could possibly imagine. This letter is very administrative and at the same time very moving. Just crying about the immense loss that those objects represented to him. So yeah, that logistical aspect, that transportation issue came up several times during the talk. I also added those few images also related to good old France, which is how scholarly narratives interact with the organizing of those exhibitions the very pragmatical way. Louis Réau, for instance, was that art historian that was trying to theorize how French art was superior to any other art produced within the world because it could expand like no other. And on the cover of his book, he uses the Oscar Rotti design of the Sawa that you can then find on stamps, right? And we've seen stamps during the conference. And we've seen some stamps and a Google image of stamps, and they, in a Warburgian sense, this is a panel of the Atlas, also carry symbol around, carry power, images of power around, despite their like smallness and flatness, you know. So I think one of the direction that history of exhibition, when I'm listening to all those talk could take, is take care of that logistical, very pragmatical aspect while still in it distinguishing, analyzing the symbolical charge of it. I think this is a very interesting way to look at things. And here at UNASHA, I'm preparing, and I advertise it like shamelessly, an issue of our scholarly magazine about the question of transports, with that detail of a crate on the cover. So that was the little sad fairy tale. I was especially, and then I need your help, Marta. I need the help of all of yours, of course, because let's start a discussion. I was amazed at the scholarly investment of all your contributors, the in-depth knowledge of lesser known sources, and I can stop that advertising now. Of the archive material. Amazed at the creativeness of certain approaches, and most of all, the consistency of the whole. It's not always the case in a conference, and we all here have attended loads of them, that each single talk maintains that like high standards of fundamental research, enthusiasm, and joy and discovery, right? This conference maintains vivid the field of exhibition studies, which never stops to reveal its richness and interest. I mean, this is an ongoing conversation we have. I've heard the expression of the tridimensionality of the exhibition during our various more informal exchanges, which I think we should all fully embrace. The exhibition's thickness, in French we would say épaisseur, like épaisseur historique, like historically thick. As an object of study, a dispositive of the exhibition that permits a still very promising diffraction of the field of art history, history of architecture, and a cultural history, material culture, diplomacy, politics in the widest sense of the word, well installed and veiled narratives with that like dialectics that's operating here, resistances of various sorts. Exhibitions are the crossroad of various approaches that the 18 talks that we've heard unfolded masterfully. The challenge of this conference was to investigate new or hidden agencies and change the focus of exhibition studies towards a renewed attention to notions such as gender, class, ethnicity, and a renewed attention to new nations, which narratives and display strategies still need to be researched more. In terms of methodology, the papers follow different paths to achieve its mission, using a wide range of sources, material from the formal flatness of the posters, for instance, and I'm thinking here of Ernesto Ullmann's design, to the more or less imposing volumes of architectural structures and fine and decorative arts, right at the end, popular and elite culture. In terms of medium, right, we navigated smoothly between architecture and stamps, poetry and administrative documents, right? We face a lot of them studying this exhibition, and we're having this discussion over lunch about the huge amount of data that you go through when you study those events. It's absolutely insane. You always need to pick carefully to find your way through it. And the question that you receive then from the audience at the end of your talk is like, yeah, but the context, right? And you have the impression you kept on trying to make the context clear, but still it's not enough because it's a box in a box in a box in a box. It's an endless work, which is great. So yeah, poetry and administrative documents, paintings and stained glasses, and so on. In terms of geography, no need to say that we traveled. Not only all of those case studies are disseminated among the globe, but most of those events saw themselves as sites of territorialisation and motionless voyage, so to speak. In Paris, I live on the Boulevard Arago, and right next to where I live, there's that huge housing unit that's built with the rest, like the material of the 1931 colonial exhibition. So each time I go back to my place on my bike, looking at it and thinking, the amount of traveling that this material have in them, embedded in them. So how do we reveal those agencies? And then we can, I guess, open up the discussion. What are the keys to understand them? Clearly, listening to all those papers, we have a whole lot of neglected agencies, the path and biographies that have been shadowed and or undermined, and that many of the talks we heard over those 2 days revealed the importance, richness, potential. Not only the implication of women architects and curators, but any kind of producers of alternate narratives. And I was particularly interested in the ongoing discussion about counter exhibitions, counter narratives. Could it be a conference topic per se? Just living this here. I was very interested in the idea of, that's a second point, material agencies. And I think this also led to some discussions over lunch that can be a reveal and research on, not notably within the frame of architectural histories, but this idea could be maybe extended to other cases. I'm thinking here to connect Ladislav Jackson's approach of pavilions materiality to Laura's, who was talking about portable objects on display, tents, and that pragmatic link between colonial expansion and the rise of a portable culture. And I must say here that this portable culture has a first rise in the 18th century. If you go back to Gian Enrico Bernasconi's great study about portable objects in the Enlightenment. But of course, the colonial expansion and the industrial culture then changes the rule of the game. Third point, from agencies to agents, one should never neglect the prosopographical approach to some extent, studying personalities, women and men, workers, activists, individuals or groups of people, their path and implication in those events, deconstructing the idea of a monolithic, anonymously orchestrated huge meeting, right? Scholars, artists, technicians, any participant, in fact. And here I would like to just do another link with the museum history and museum theory. We're kind of done with that idea of the monolithic museum as an institution of domination in a very Foucauldian sense. I mean, this helped a lot, but the human factor, it's still a whole mess. You study a history of a big, huge museum, and you for instance, when a painting gets stolen, and you go through the archive and you see how individuals actually interact and make history with their own eccentricities and competence and skills or talents. A last aspect I would call is maybe I wrote that while listening to other talks, receptive agencies, as we've seen today through papers discussing the impact of those events from different perspectives and recontextualizing various discourses in a global scale. Yeah, this is too drafty to be discussed, but another question I asked myself while listening to y'all is, as an historian, art historian, the power and the potential of, it's a way more general statement, of the case study. And it was really interesting to see how we need to go through the case study and in-depth knowledge of archives and material to then go back to some kind of panoramic view that Mary gave to us during the brilliant keynote lecture. But I'm always having that problem. I'm working at that sinking boat, right? And the history of it, the tale of it is incredible because because the material itself is really seducing in a way, in a sad way. But what to do with them, how to, take one step back and actually write like a conceptually powerful history. And of course, in the case of that boat, you imagine that the only interpretation that you could possibly think of is a France that promotes itself so much that it self-destructs. And when you write in 1939, and it's about to collaborate with the enemy, and you cannot see anything else. But that's what I think that somehow the fall of an empire of some sort, and of course leaving room for research, not only about about France, but all other nations that have been less observed, at least here in the publications in the 90s and early 2000s about exhibition history. I have no question right now. Can you help me?
Where do I go from here? Thank you very much. I think you summarized quite, really well, some of the main issues that we have been discussing here. And I have to kind of, from my personal point of view, admit that before we started planning this conference, I was thinking, is there anything new you can still say about exhibitions and World's Fairs? Because you've got tons of publications and sometimes I did notice that when I tell people what I'm looking at, what I'm researching, they kind of go, World's Fairs again. And but I think that we showed in the 2 days that there's so much else that still needs to be done. So many questions that we can ask and that can enrich exhibition studies. And it was really interesting for me to hear some of the answers to all those questions we had during the discussions, where basically I don't know. There's still really a lot we don't know, and whether we can find out or not is another matter, because there's something quite important that came to me in the 2 days as well, is that there's all that material on the one hand that we get kind of overwhelmed by in the archives, and I can sort of add to the kind of discussion by saying that I was sitting in this archive in Berkeley and going through tons and tons of documents listing how many bulbs were supplied for the Czechoslovak pavilion, and you have to go through it because there might be just something really kind of important, but there wasn't, and but I still had to kind of know what they actually brought in terms of equipment and everything. So you've got on the one hand all this kind of wealth of material, but on the other hand there is all this that's missing, and it's the accounts of the individuals, of the women, or of the workers, of the craftsmen, and perhaps we will never find out what their role was or what they thought about the exhibitions. But I think we can kind of try and kind of negotiate that within the context that we're dealing with. And something that again was mentioned earlier is that the way we use the material is also important, because we can have photographs documenting an aspect of an exhibition, but how do we know it's real? How do we know it's not staged? And again, it's for us to kind of distinguish the truth again, and authenticity. So I guess for me, it really highlighted the lack of knowledge that we still have about World's Fairs, and it is really about the role of individuals, groups of people, and those that actually made these exhibitions happen. So so I would probably leave it there, and I'm sure that probably there are many other comments that want to kind of add to this with the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the nationalism complex. We think everything has been said, everything has been deconstructed enough. We have the stable but bibliography about it. Still listening to those endless configurations, right? I still think it must be refined and refined and refined even more. And that's what I thought of while listening to all the conferences in context I had no idea about entangled identitarian construction. And it's endless, really.
Well, I mean, this obviously this particular event has brought up, a really important aspect of the way that World's fairs and exhibitions should be thought about. But Marta and I have had lots of conversations about this. I think it is a very rich field, and almost I say that it's tended to perhaps be not done. I'm struggling here for the right word, but not necessarily done a good service. And I count myself in terms of things that I've written about exhibitions as well. In terms of there's been obviously a very large focus on, broadly speaking, I suppose, the ethnographic paradigm. And what I mean by that is that, the concern about exhibitions as in their role as representatives of national culture and within the kind of competition. But there's so many other ways as well that one can think of exhibitions in terms of, for example, the history of science. Where are the detailed analyses of the halls of industry, for example? It just doesn't happen because, or within the history of technology, or even we all like to look at those kind of, the sort of magazines, the publications that are produced alongside the exhibitions. And it's always, we tend to look at the adverts. We find, oh, that's quite interesting. But there's never been a systematic study of the kinds of advertising policies, who advertises and how, and what are their strategies, and what, does that tell us anything, in terms of, I don't know, the international profiles of companies and organizations and so forth. There is an awful lot of material. And I guess in a way, what this event has, for me personally, has pointed to the fact that there are still many new ways of thinking about this material, and that maybe, the first step is to become a little bit less concerned about this question of almost of national pavilions, and look at other things. Even think of the endless exhibitions there were about agricultural pavilions. What contribution did world fairs make to the advancement of agricultural technologies, for example? I mean, personally, I don't find that particularly exciting, but it's probably, yeah, but that just shows our biases, doesn't it? But probably there's something quite important there to be said. Or, all sorts of other things, education. You had so many pavilions about education, didn't you? To what extent did that contribute towards the dissemination and international ideas of, ideas about educational techniques and practices and so forth? Obviously, I don't know the answer, but there's still a wealth of questions maybe that need to be teased out.
I have an immediate follow-up to that. Thank you very much. Here we go. Wrong. What am I doing? A few doors from here sits Sophie CRAACE. She's at Paris 1 as a professor, and she currently works on the display of economy, exhibitions about economy. And it's a very fascinating project that she started a year ago. I think she's gonna maybe work on her habilitation about it, but those fields and disciplines that are, which are very counterintuitive. I mean, it's hard to have economy on display, right? And she's interested in that, and how specialists in the field of economy use display strategies from other fields to promote their own work, right? if she was here, she could talk about it. Unfortunately, I cannot. But yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. First of all, as you know, I work in Germany, and a lot of what I've academic decades have been in Germany. And it's been very refreshing to be part of this conference, because there at many world exhibition conferences and events, there was always been a focus on the object by the great architect. 99% of the time it was a great man. And also urban planning. So a big focus on the big picture of an exhibition ground. And it was almost like, not the bird's eye view here, but really the bird's view of this exhibition, more of exhibitions, really experience it more from the ground. The other interesting comment, just comparing this to what I've experienced in Germany, this incredible emphasis on craft that was just a theme that ran through almost all the talks today. And I don't think I've ever heard it in Germany, or if I have, I've forgotten about. So here it was very, very dominant. But you know, you just go one country over, and it was very interesting that the discourses, the contemporary discourses, the focus is quite different. And I find that very interesting, and maybe that's something you want to think about as well. But it was very exciting, confounding at times, but nevertheless fascinating to hear. And last but not least, I think Sam's paper hit such a nerve, because I think you're touching on some aspect that we still poo-poo in these exhibitions, which is this financial aspect. I mean, they had to make money, right? And Matthew talked about the ads. We all love looking at the ads, but there's this other stuff, the midway plaisance, you know, the flip-flop or whatever it is. I mean, all this other stuff that happens for entertainment, but ultimately to produce some kind of revenue for these events. And I think still we're very hesitant to really start thinking about that and what that stuff means, and what it tells us about these events as well. And they're phenomenally well documented. If you kind of scratch the surface, Harriet will find pictures. So I think that's something very exciting that you've touched upon here. Thank you.
Sorry, so this is a thought, and it sort of relates in a way to what you said, because I think one of the things that I've found very interesting is in my PhD, I was very much thinking about exhibitions as a sort of national, you know, a representation of national pride and a national, you know, nationalist phenomenon. And recently I've started to think about the gap between the commissioning bodies, nations and other authorities, and the kind of way that other sort of agendas were being activated within these spaces, and finding the kind of, you know, that kind of desertoian idea of the kind of gap between the sort of strategies played out by government, say, and the kind of tactics of those who are operating within these, the kind of playful tactics, and the way in which, in fact, all of these different agents, these different designers, these different small organizations are all pursuing their own agendas within these spaces. And in a way, kind of, there's not enough, I think, written about the kind of discrepancy between those different agents yet. It's developing more, but I think that's in a way the space that is still needing to be kind of worked on, is that kind of just sort of the entanglements, in a sense, that are happening within these spaces, and the kind of mess of different people building their professions sometimes, and building their professional networks, and sometimes actually pursuing agendas, building things that they don't really agree with and actually conflict with their own kind of personal and professional identities. And so that whole mess I find interesting.
Don't want to run this fruitful discussion into a dark corner, but I want to add to what Mary said. One of the biggest projects in German art history 10, 15 years ago was the big Nazi exhibitions from 1937 until 1944, ran in Munich, And Christian Fuhrmeister and his team digitized each and every image, each and every meter of each and every exhibitions, because the Nazis were very orderly in documenting their big exhibitions. And what happened is, they have everything at the ZE in Munich. They have all the documents, they digitized everything. We can go online, we can click on every centimeter. So last September, there was yet another conference about Nazi art in Munich. And my colleagues stand there, and they stood there and they said, what should we do? We don't get any additional funding by the German Research Council because we don't know how to qualify our stuff. So that's, I guess, as I said, I don't want to run this discussion into a dark corner, but obviously the other side is it can be very positivistic, people collecting stuff in archive. And I found it really interesting what Victor said, the expensive nature of exhibition. I would also say it's the expensive nature of our research, which we sometimes need to qualify, stop, take a bird's view or something else, take a step back or do something else, not to run into the same problems as the people in Munich.
This bird view thing, I almost put it in the little PowerPoint. I had to do some general statement, and I thought it was using an artwork as a purely illustrative thing. But I was thinking of Manet, Edouard Manet's painting of, it's a view of the 1867 Paris Fair. It's right now in Denmark, I guess, at the museum. And you can see like a beautiful, ambiguous Paris scene by Manet, seen from the Trocadero. Looks very different today, but maybe during your tour you'll get an idea. And Manet depicts different class people, like working class people, a gardener, bourgeois, people walking. There's the National Guard. There's a kid. There are animals. Such a brilliant scene, and you can see people looking at the view, looking at the panorama of that new hill in Paris, from that new hill. And you see a couple, I guess a couple, and the man has a pair of, comment on dit, jumelles? Sorry? Binoculars, yeah. And he's looking at us towards the sky where a balloon is floating further. This is the bird's view on the exhibition. And the people down on Earth are the human factors, so to speak. And I guess this link that we need to make permanently between the systemic aspect of it and the long term and the actual individual implication in them is we should go back and forth and be on that line, you know, on that like side perspective, yeah. Are we rushed?
We're being reminded of the time. One last comment. Okay, it's not the last comment, not to stress you out, so we can carry on discussing later. So please a comment or...